She called my mother a burden. She said it quietly, like it was nothing, like she was commenting on the weather. But there were 220 people in that room, and sound carries in a church hall, and I heard every word. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I took the ring box off the gift table, walked back to where she was standing, and held out my hand. "Give it back," I said. That was 3 years ago. What happened the next morning is the reason I'm telling this story now. My name is James. I'm 58 years old. I spent 31 years working in commercial insurance, the kind of work nobody thinks is interesting until something goes wrong, and suddenly everyone needs a man like me. I raised 2 kids, mostly on my own after my first wife passed. I coached Little League for 11 seasons. I mow my own lawn. I am not a dramatic man, but I am a man who loves his mother. My mother, May, grew up in eastern Kentucky, the daughter of a tobacco farmer. She married young, worked hard her entire life, cleaned other people's homes for decades, and never once complained about any of it. She kept a vegetable garden in the backyard even into her late 70s. She made her own bread every Sunday morning. She still called me every Saturday at 9 o'clock, no matter what. When I met Beverly, I thought I had found something real. She was 52, an interior designer with a firm in Charleston. We met at a conference. I was there for work. She was there to speak on a panel about residential renovation trends. She was polished and sharp and funny in a way that caught me off guard. We talked for 3 hours that first night. I drove home thinking I hadn't felt that alive in years. We dated for 14 months. She met my kids, my grandkids, my friends. Everyone liked her. My daughter said she seemed put together. My son said she seemed a little intense, but that he could see she made me happy. That was enough. I introduced her to my mother about 4 months in. Looking back, I saw the signs. I just didn't want to read them. Beverly called my mother's house charming, which is the word people use when they don't want to say small. She made a comment about the carpet, said something about how she could help me update things if Mom ever wanted to move somewhere easier to maintain. Mom just smiled and offered her more sweet tea. But I noticed that Mom didn't bring out her photo albums. She always brought out the albums. After we left, Mom called me the next morning, not on Saturday, which was unusual, and asked me one question. "James, does she know how to be quiet and just be grateful for something?" I didn't understand what she meant at the time. I do now. I proposed to Beverly in October at a restaurant in Savannah she had specifically mentioned wanting to visit. She said yes. She cried, and I believed every tear. We set the date for the following June. Beverly took over the planning almost immediately, which I didn't mind. I'm not a flowers and centerpieces kind of man. I told her my only condition. My mother walks in on my arm, and she sits in the front row, and she is treated like the most important person in that room. Beverly agreed without hesitation. The engagement period was when things started to shift, slowly, the way water erodes stone. You don't notice it day by day. You only notice it when you look back at where you started. Beverly began making comments about my mother. Small ones at first. That Mom repeated herself too much. That she didn't understand why I still drove 40 minutes every Sunday to have lunch with her when she seemed perfectly independent. She once said, within earshot of my son, that she hoped Mom wouldn't need too much from us once we were married. I said something that time. I told Beverly that my mother never asked anything from anyone, and that I visited her on Sundays because I wanted to, not because I felt obligated. Beverly said I was being sensitive. I let it go. That was my mistake. The week before the wedding, Beverly's sister Pauline flew in from Atlanta. I had met Pauline twice. She was the kind of woman who turned every conversation toward herself, who had an opinion about things she hadn't been asked about. She and Beverly spent most of that week at the venue, adjusting details I had stopped paying attention to. On the morning of the rehearsal dinner, Beverly sat down across from me at the kitchen table with what I can only describe as a business expression. Measured, prepared. She told me that she had been thinking about the seating arrangement, that with the family dynamics and the flow of the room, it might actually be smoother if my mother sat at a family table toward the middle rather than the front. that the front row was getting crowded with Beverly's relatives, her parents, her aunts, Pauline's family. I sat with that for a moment. My mother sits in front, I said. That was the one thing I asked. Beverly tilted her head and smiled, the kind of smile that isn't really a smile. I'm just thinking about what makes sense for everyone, James. I moved my mother back to the front row that afternoon. I didn't discuss it further. The wedding was June 14th. The church was beautiful. The flowers were Beverly's vision, and I'll give credit where it's due. She had taste. 220 guests. My daughter cried during the vows. My son gave a toast at the reception that made the whole room laugh. My mother wore a blue dress she had ordered from a catalog and had pressed 3 times because she wanted it to look right. She had her hair done at the salon she'd gone to for 20 years. She looked wonderful. She was beaming. Everything was fine until the receiving line. We were standing near the entrance to the hall, greeting guests as they came through. My mother was beside me. She had just hugged my daughter's family and was turning to say something to me when Beverly's cousin, a woman named Shelley, who I had met exactly once, leaned toward Beverly and said something that was meant to be a whisper. It wasn't. Is that his mother? She looks like she just came from a church rummage sale. Beverly didn't correct her. She didn't say anything. She laughed. It was a small laugh, barely audible, but my mother heard it, and I heard it, and I Tamity, and the 3 people standing immediately behind us heard it too. My mother's face changed for just a second. Then she put her smile back on, because that's what May does, and turned to greet the next guest. But I had already stopped shaking the hand I was holding. I stepped out of the receiving line. Beverly looked at me, surprised. James, did you just laugh at my mother? She lowered her voice. I didn't laugh at anything. Shelley was just... She insulted my mother. And you laughed. Beverly put her hand on my arm. You're overreacting. This isn't the moment. I looked at her hand on my arm. I looked at my mother, who was still standing there smiling, pretending she hadn't heard, pretending her cheeks weren't flushed. I thought about the seating arrangement. I thought about the comments, about her carpet. I thought about, does she know how to be grateful for something? I thought about every small thing I had chosen to overlook for 14 months because I wanted this to be real. I walked to the gift table. I picked up the small card box where Beverly had arranged for the rings to be kept during the reception. I took out my wedding band. We hadn't done a ring exchange yet. We were waiting for after dinner, and I held it in my fist for a moment. Then I walked back to Beverly and held out my palm. I need you to give me the ring. The room hadn't gone quiet yet. No one fully understood what was happening. Beverly stared at me. James, stop! You're embarrassing yourself. I'm not. Give me the ring. Her face shifted. I had never seen that expression on her before. For a moment, she looked genuinely uncertain, like she was calculating something. She took off the ring. She placed it in my hand. I turned to the guests nearest to us. My brother-in-law, my son, Beverly's parents. And I said, calmly as I could, I'm sorry, the wedding is over. Then I went to my mother, took her hand, and walked her outside. We sat in my car in the parking lot for 20 minutes. She didn't say anything for the first 5. Then she said, James, you didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. She patted my hand. That was all. What I didn't know, what none of us knew yet, was that the night was not even close to over. My son called me around 11 that evening. I was at my mother's house. We had eaten leftover casserole from her refrigerator and watched the news together, and I had almost managed to feel normal. Dad, he said, I need to tell you something, and you need to stay calm when I do. His voice had the specific quiet of someone delivering bad news. He told me that Beverly's sister, Pauline, had come to him at the reception after I left. Apparently, the reception had continued for some people, which I found both absurd and not surprising, and had said something that she seemed to believe was a comfort. She told my son that Beverly had talked for months about restructuring things after the wedding, that Beverly had known my mother-owned property, a rental house 2 towns over and a piece of land I'd inherited from my own father, and had been speaking with a financial advisor friend of Pauline's about how marital assets might apply in a situation like this. I sat with that for a long time. My mother's house was not my house. The rental property and the land were mine, held in a trust my father had set up before he passed. They were not jointly owned. I had not discussed them in detail with Beverly, only mentioned in passing that I had some assets from my family, but apparently that mention had been enough to set something in motion. The next morning, I called my attorney. He had done my estate planning and knew the trust documentation. I explained what my son had told me. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "James, given what you've just told me, I think we need to look at a few things." Over the next 2 weeks, we looked at a lot of things. Beverly's financial advisor friend turned out to be a man named Gerald, who was not a licensed advisor, but had done consulting work in what my attorney described diplomatically as asset transition planning. Pauline had connected them. There had been a meeting, documented because Gerald had sent a follow-up email that Pauline had forwarded to my son by accident when she was trying to forward something else, in which Beverly had discussed whether a spouse could have any claim on inherited trust assets in South Carolina. The answer, as my attorney explained, was almost certainly no, particularly given how the trust was structured. Beverly had likely been told this too, eventually. But the fact that the meeting had happened, the fact that it had happened 4 months before the wedding while she was still telling me she'd be happy in a double wide if I was in it, that was what I kept returning to. I filed for dissolution of the marriage on the grounds of fraud. South Carolina is not a state where annulment is commonly granted for adults, but my attorney believed we had grounds based on the misrepresentation of intent. The process took 7 months. Beverly contested initially, then stopped. She received nothing because there was nothing to receive. We had no joint assets. We'd been married for approximately 4 hours. But here is the part of the story I haven't told yet. The part my mother made me promise to include if I ever talked about this publicly. The rental property 2 towns over, the one I'd mentioned to Beverly in passing, is a 12-unit apartment building on a street that used to be nothing and is now walking distance from a tech company's new regional campus. I bought it 22 years ago for $340,000. Last year, a developer offered me $2.8 million for it. I didn't sell. I'm still deciding. My mother knew what that building was worth. She is the one who told me to buy it in the first place. She drove out there with me when I was 36 years old, and we walked the street together and she said, "James, this neighborhood is going to change. I can feel it." She was right, the way she's been right about most things I've been smart enough to listen to. Beverly saw a woman in a catalog dress with pressed creases. She had no idea who she was laughing at. A year after the wedding that wasn't, I started volunteering with a financial literacy program at a community center in Columbia. My mother's idea, actually. She said I had more time on my hands than I knew what to do with, and that I should put it somewhere useful. She was right about that, too. I met a woman there named Cecilia. She runs the program. She's 55, a former teacher, came back to Columbia after her own marriage ended, grew up in a small town about 30 miles from where my mother grew up. The first time we had coffee, she asked me about my mother, and then actually listened to the answer for 20 minutes without checking her phone once. We've been together for 8 months. I introduced her to Mom last Easter. Mom brought out the photo albums. I don't know how the rest of this goes. I'm 58 years old and I have stopped pretending I know how any of it goes. But I know that on the day I stood in a receiving line and heard someone mock the woman who cleaned other people's floors so I could have new shoes for school, I finally stopped choosing peace over truth. My mother wore blue that day. She looked wonderful. She sat in the front row and she left with her dignity intact, and that is the only thing about that day that mattered. She still calls me every Saturday at 9 o'clock. I still pick up on the first ring. I've been thinking about what I want to say here because I don't want to wrap this up in a bow and make it sound neater than it was. Life doesn't work that way. I know that better at 58 than I did at 30. What I keep coming back to is this. Beverly didn't lose because I found out about the meetings with Gerald. She didn't lose because the trust was structured in a way that protected the assets. She lost something much earlier than that, and she did it entirely on her own. She lost the moment she decided that a woman in a pressed catalog dress wasn't worth basic decency. That's not a legal outcome. That's not luck. That's just the way things tend to settle when you build something on the wrong foundation. I've seen it in 31 years of insurance work. People who cut corners, who misrepresent things, who make decisions based on what they think they can get away with instead of what's actually true. It catches up. Not always dramatically, not always quickly, but it catches up. Beverly's version of this played out in about 4 hours. My mother never asked for any of it. She never asked me to end that marriage. She sat in the parking lot of that church hall and told me I didn't have to do it. That's who May is. She spent decades cleaning other people's homes without resentment, growing her own food, showing up for people who didn't always show up for her, and she never once confused what she had with who she was. That separation between what you own and what you're worth is something most people spend their whole lives trying to figure out. My mother just lived it. I think about the kind of clarity that requires. Not stubbornness, not pride, just a settled understanding of what actually matters. That's not something you get handed. It's built, slowly, through years of making decisions that cost you something in the short term, but keep you intact over the long run. My mother built that. Beverly was trying to acquire it by other means, and that never works. What I want to say to anyone listening, especially if you're at a point where something feels off but you keep explaining it away, is that the small things are not small. The comment about the carpet, the laugh in the receiving line, the seating arrangement I had to fight to restore. Each of those things was information. I had it. I chose not to read it. That's on me, and I've made my peace with it, but I'm not going to pretend the signs weren't there. Courage isn't just doing something hard. Sometimes courage is stopping. Stopping and saying, "This is not what I agreed to. This is not who I thought you were. I'm not willing to keep going and find out what comes next." I stopped. It cost me a wedding and 7 months of legal proceedings and more than a few bad nights. What it gave me back was something I didn't realize I'd been slowly handing away. My own sense of what I would and wouldn't accept. You can't put a number on that. You can't put it in a trust. My mother is 81 years old. She still makes bread on Sunday mornings. She still calls me every Saturday at 9. I still pick up on the first ring. That's the whole story. That's all of it.